Then the Lord answered Job out of a whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me." Job wants to talk to God. Zophar wants God to talk to Job. But I suspect no one expected a loud voice out of a raging storm. Now, that would get your attention. This was a very public display, but it's not until the very, very, very end that God speaks to anybody except for Job. God picks up the challenge that Job had thrown out. Sort of. Job had wanted to know what the charges against him were, and he doesn't find out. Job had wanted to know why he suffered, and he doesn't find that out either. When God starts to speak, he completely changes the subject. So we sort of get the idea that Job and his friends were both asking the wrong questions and seeking the wrong answers. And God comes with questions. Many, many questions. God also used questions to draw the hiding Adam into some honest discussion about what had happened. Almost always, Jesus answers questions with his own question, reframing the subject or drawing people deeper. Dr. Bruce Wilkie made the comment that questions invite us to look at a situation from a different perspective. And this is most certainly the invitation that Job is receiving. The "can you," "did you," "do you know" sounds kind of insulting and belittling to us. Although it would have been a lot worse if God had said, "You can't, you don't know." I don't think there's insult in this. God is really honoring Job with this vision of God's world. It is, however, belittling. That's not a bad thing. Because as Job's view of God gets bigger and bigger, his view of himself just naturally gets smaller. Job had never questioned that God was the creator. So God begins with a deep dive into what it actually meant for him to create. And he uses some beautiful poetic imagery. It took a lot of wisdom, skill, a vision for beauty, as well as power to create the earth, to birth the seas and establish their boundaries. God directs Job's attention to light and dark, to the depths of the seas, to the many aspects of weather. He looks at the heavens, highlighting his control over the rhythm and the rules of the universe. And we see that wisdom is a tool that God uses. So stop and put yourself in Job's sandals for a minute. It is most likely that if Job had seen any ocean, and he might not have, it would have been standing on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. He knew nothing of the expanse of water that covers our planet or the complexity of its depths. He knew nothing of the scale and the range and the scope and the variety of the landmass that makes up our planet. He probably would have seen more of the night sky than we do because we have light pollution that he wouldn't have. But he didn't have the magic of NASA's library of amazing space photos. God is exposing Job to aspects of creation that he had never seen, that he had never even dreamed of. God is painting an overwhelmingly vast backdrop for the rest of his speech. If this made God seem big and Job seems small, the effect should be even greater on us. Through our own personal travel or through travelogues, we have seen so much of our planet and beyond. even more than Job, we should stand in awe because we know more of the vastness. I think that's a challenge because it's so easy to take it for granted and not stop and live with the wonder that our planet is, that our universe is. Then God brings the focus from the vast down to some specific animals: lions, ravens, mountain goats, wild donkeys, wild ox, ostrich, warhorse, and the eagle. Now, it's interesting to note that none of these animals are domesticated. They are outside of the life and control of people. The warhorse seems like maybe the one exception to that, but it is presented here through the eyes of the horse. He is strong, he is brave, he likes to fight. He is not being presented as a servant of humanity, as a servant of men. We see God's care, his thoughtful design, and his enjoyment of his creation. God finds prey for the lions. He feeds the young ravens. He watches over the mountain goats as they give birth. He gives the wild donkey freedom and a wild terrain to enjoy, far from the restraints of civilization. The wild ox is now extinct, but once roamed from Spain all the way to Asia and through most of Europe. They were large. They were 6'6" or so at their shoulders. They were strong, aggressive, and sometimes dangerous. They could not be tamed. They could not be made to serve people. And I think we can imagine God smiling as he looks at his silly ostrich, who is happily flapping wings that do her no good at all. God did not give her wisdom, but oh, he gave her speed. And I think joy. He is proud of the mighty warhorse. And it is by God's wisdom that the eagle soars and builds its nest up in the rocky crags. The Creator enjoys the things he has made. And I think that is generally true for artists, of whom God is supreme. This section gives us a glimpse into the thought that God put into the creation of each animal and the ongoing attention and care that they receive. Psalm 145 tells us that God is loving toward all he has made. Think about what that actually means. God gives this kind of attention to every single animal, to every living thing. That's huge. He knows when and where every birth on the planet takes place. He feeds and watches over the flight of every bird that exists. He cares for the hedgehogs and the octopus and the worm, for the armadillo and the lemur and the trout, for the grasshopper and the elephant and the sea anemone, for every pine tree in the forest, for the cotton grass on the tundra and the cactus in the desert. And he watches over you and me. A God who can easily juggle that many balls, and this is really only a tiny aspect of his creation, that God is able to take care of my crisis of the moment and of yours. We do not need to fear. God ends this section with, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You are God's critic. Do you have any answers? And Job replies, I am insignificant. How can I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hands. I have already said too much. I have nothing more to say. God has thoroughly demonstrated that he has the skill and the wisdom and compassion and power to run the universe well. So he moves on to another subject, justice. Now, in the previous section, God is indirectly answering Job's questions, but here he specifically mentioned Job's complaint. Will you discredit my justice? And he challenges Job to rule the world just for a little while. Basic requirements are power, majesty, honor, glory, and splendor. And then Job can try his hand at bringing low the proud, crushing the wicked, and killing the bad guys. Now, clearly, only God has power, majesty, honor, glory, and splendor. But his wisdom and discernment are also critical when it comes to the moral questions of the world. Had we been in charge of the world, I'm pretty sure we would have taken out Saul when he was arranging for the deaths of all those Christians in the early church in Jerusalem. But God knew better. God knows the heart of all people and the potential of the heart of God people. He knows where all the puzzles of the time fit together. And the complexity of the moral universe, which is beyond our understanding, is not beyond his. We live in a broken, fallen world. There is evil, there are bad guys. It is fair to be angry about that. Jesus was angry. It is fair to pray against their success and to pray for their downfall. Just look at Psalms. And there may be times when we actually have to act against the evil that we see around us. But the good and the bad are both in God's hands. He is in control. So, alongside the anger and the fear, our baseline trust in our very big God can give us the peace and the patience as we wait for God to resolve the justice issues in our life and in our world. The first set of animals that God discusses were outside of the human domain or human control. These last two animals are animals that people would have considered dangerous, enemies, maybe even evil. Behemoth, many people feel like, is the hippo. Now, our image of hippo is those fat, kind of lazy, a little bit boring animals that you see at the zoo. Or cute little stuffed hippos that we send to our kids or our grandkids. Nice little hippos. It does not connotate fear. We would have a lot more respect for him, however, if we lived closer to them in their homeland. Hippos are big. They weigh from 3,000 to 9,000 pounds. They are 10 to 16 feet long. And although they look very clumsy, on land, they can outrun people for short distances. However, they can outrun people for I can catch you distances. So they are very territorial. And Justin, you want to change that picture? In their water space. So they have been known to flip boats and drown people when their boat got too close to their space. It's estimated that about 500 people a year die from hippos in Africa, which is more than lions or crocodiles or most any other animal in Africa. There were a lot more wild hippos back in the day. So we can imagine that number might have been even higher back when they weren't mostly on reserves. And the weapons of Job's day, knives, arrows, swords, really wouldn't have been very effective against a hippo. A battle between a human and a hippo would not have gone well for the human. So fear would have been a really legitimate response. Leviathan has been identified as a dragon, maybe a marine dinosaur, but most people settle on crocodile. But our initial reaction to crocodile is similar to hippo. I mean, we know they can attack people. We know they can kill people. But we've also seen people wrestling with them in videos. This description is way scarier than that. But people who study ancient animals have skeletal evidence for several species of prehistoric crocodiles. Some of them live like crocs today. kind of on that boundary land between water and land. Some were sea-bearing all of the time. This is a Machismo rex. There was a lot of discussion actually online on why it had a dinosaur-sounding name when everybody agrees it's a crocodile, but I don't know. It's based on a, whoops, you left, come back. It's based on a fossil that was found in Tunisia in 2016. The skull of the fossil was 5 feet, and they estimate that the rest of the body was between 23 and 30 feet. There is skeletal evidence for ancient crocs that were up to 50 feet long. Truly, that would be terrifying. That would be very scary. And it may be that some of their great-great-great-grandchildren were still out frolicking in the ocean, and God was referencing those. We don't really know. And we don't need to, because God's point was that these animals represent the wild world that's not really a part of where people go. It's not part of our world. And it is scary and dangerous to us. But it is still a part of the world that God made and controls and enjoys. This is his final declaration of humans. It is not all about you. I have more. God's world, which he governs well, includes so much more than we see or can even imagine. It includes things that we see as beautiful and as good. And it includes things that we view as scary and terrible. The animals were big and scary and legitimately dangerous. There are events which are also big and scary and dangerous. We don't need to declare them good, because they might not be good for us at all. But they are in God's control, like Behemoth and Leviathan. We don't understand them. It is beyond us. But we can rest and trust, because it is not beyond the God who loves us. Job's response to the first speech was an acknowledgement of how small he was. By now, he is just completely blown out of the water. I know you can do all things. There's no purpose of yours that can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Job had wanted answers, and he was not given them. But what he was given was presence. And it was more than enough. It was so much more than enough. And then it goes on, and in NIV it says, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So part of my preparation for this, I listened to an online class on Job from Regent University in British Columbia. And the professor also is the Hebrew teacher, and most of the students had taken Hebrew. So that was woven all the way through. And he did a deep dive on this verse. So I want to share some of that with you. The Hebrew poetry, and you remember that Job is written all in poetry except chapters 1 and 2 and the end of the last chapter. But the style of poetry has a certain number of syllables for every line. And in order to do that, the author sometimes leaves out parts of speech that normally would be there. So in this phrase, that first phrase, it can be translated, I repent, I retract, or I despise. But it doesn't have the direct object that ought to go with it in either Hebrew or in English. So translators who are trying to make it clear as well as accurate will sometimes try to figure out what should go there, what the author was thinking about, and put it in so that it's a little clearer for us. The second phrase, the I repent in dust and ashes, in can also be translated of. So dust and ashes were a sign of mourning. Job has been in dust and ashes since chapter 3. Some people like NIV here, think that Job is mourning his mistaken view of God. So he's accentuating the I'm going to mourn because I actually realized I kind of got some of this wrong. Others feel like he is repenting from his mourning. So he's turning from repenting from the door, and repenting is just turn, right? From the mourning that he was doing, and he is turning to getting on with life, rejoicing in the majesty of the God that he now understands more fully. So a couple of other potential translations that he gave, and this is the one that he made when he actually translated Job. I reject and repent of dust and ashes. So he's leaning to the turning away from my mourning and turning to God, turning to joy and life. Another one was I retract my words and repent of dust and ashes. It's not really a question of which is right because they work with Hebrew. But Job sees God as much bigger than anything he ever knew. And he sees himself as smaller, less important than he had thought. When we hear, I despise myself, we tend to connotate self-hatred. And self-hatred is not part of this at all. To see ourselves small in God's world is extremely realistic. To hate ourselves is to insult and violate the love of God, the love which Jesus took to the cross for us. We are small. We are much loved. And then we looked at the epilogue, God's evaluation of Job and his friends, the very large sacrifice, Job's prayer for his friends and the forgiveness of sin that came through that, the many years of blessing he had, and that he died as a happy old man. But now that we know the whole story, I want to go back to the prologue a minute. Job was repeatedly called blameless and upright, a servant of God. And that's actually what caused all of his suffering. We are never actually thrilled with the innocent suffering. It bothers us. But the book of Job seems to make it worse because it kind of looks like Job's pain was actually caused by a bet that Satan enticed God into. And it just feels so wrong. And then with chapter 3, nobody knows what happened in chapters 1 and 2. So the story all goes this way and it spins down and down and down. And we're left uncomfortable. Or maybe something stronger than that. But what if chapters 1 and 2 aren't the whole story either? What if there is a higher, bigger story that even Satan didn't see? Dr. Tim Mackey of Bible Project mentioned that the Old Testament is like blue light jazz, where one theme is woven through a song, but it's played in different keys on different instruments, and the sounds will be similar but different, harmonious and unique. Well, the example didn't actually resonate with me because I don't know too much about jazz. So I called Gloria. I said, Gloria, do classical people do that? And she said she thought Bach did. So she talked to some other friends and came back. And that is what Bach is playing with in his 2-part Invention series, although it doesn't change instruments. Did you enjoy? We were watching some of that when you guys came in. So Bach has a theme, but some parts he turns it upside down. He changes the key. He embellishes the theme. He switches which hand is actually playing the major parts of it. You see the same theme. Well, I guess you hear the same theme, but it's not boring. And each change adds more richness and beauty. That's how the Old Testament works. There are a number of themes that weave through the whole Old Testament. You hear it in this story, a little bit different in this person's story, a little bit different in this person's story, but the same theme is running through. and we can hear it if we listen. So what thread is Job's story part of? Where have we heard that before? The theme is the innocent sufferer who through his obedience brings God's blessing to others. Job suffered, but he hung on. He refused to curse God. And then he was able to act as a priest for his friends, with forgiveness coming through his prayers. We see Joseph in prison, innocent suffering. He's there because he would not have sex with his slave master's wife. And an innocent who suffered for years. And yet, that put him in the position to interpret Pharaoh's dream and to save the lives of hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And I'm sure if you think about it, you'll pick other people who are also in that thread. All of these examples point to the ultimate innocent one who would suffer to bring forgiveness and life to all who believe in his name. Jesus, the righteous servant of God, suffered in the wilderness. He suffered taunts from religious, godly men. He suffered a terrible death and the wrath of God on our behalf. Satan and Job had no idea of this higher plan, that Job would be part of pointing people to Jesus and exalting God, that his story would be read for centuries, encouraging and strengthening believers. Satan's plan to destroy Job and insult God backfired fairly big time. And God, whose wisdom and whose sneakiness is far beyond us, probably just sat and smiled because he knew where all this was going. God weaves themes through his story. He also weaves things through our stories. We're going to watch Bach two-part inventions for F major and F minor. And as you do, listen for the themes to run through. And as you listen, or maybe after you leave, consider some of the themes that God has woven through your life, the places where his love has shown up, the skills and gifts he's given you. Our God is good and creative. He is wise and caring. He is powerful and loving. And he is so worthy of our worship. So let's go ahead and listen. And when the music is done, so are we.